Okay, so I'm joined today by Professor Victoria Hurth, and Victoria wears many, many hats, which we will hear about in just a moment. But Victoria, I would suggest, is probably a specialist, you could say expert in the concept of value. So what we're talking about today is the concept of the value of value, and it'll be a very interesting exploration into and I guess quite a deep dive into some of the concepts around the idea of value within organizations. So welcome, Victoria. It's going to be an interesting little exercise, this one, I think.
Well, without wanting to take up the whole time talking about the history of it, yeah, I basically in the last sort of almost 20 years, I've been focusing very much on the role of business in bringing about a world that we as humanity want to see come about. And so it really starts from that level. So everything I do tries to be very practical and bring it into a place where it is usable, but really tries to go as deep as I possibly can to surface some of those deep-seated perspectives, I suppose, that hold us back. And the idea of value as a concept is one of those key foundational topics. And what we do or don't think about what value is shapes how we make decisions, I would say. But yeah, so at the moment, having been an associate professor at a business school for about 7 years, I've recently become an independent pracademic, you might say, and I have a number of hats, including visiting fellow of Judge Business School at Cambridge University and senior associate of the Cambridge University Institute for Sustainability Leadership. And I also am a convener of what will be the first global standard in good governance of organizations, ISO 37000. So that's due to come out within about a year's time, and I'm a director of a non-executive director of a couple of organizations as well.
That's really interesting. So pretty much well qualified in the art of creation of value, and that'll be something that we'll explore in a little while. So just taking a few, I guess, steps back into the sort of foundations that you described there of sort of arriving where you are today. When did you first kind of realize or start to recognize that the concept of value is pretty much at the heart of kind of everything within business? When was that kind of first sort of realization of its importance?
Well, I think I have to start that question by saying, for me, value needs to be anchored to something. So whilst we talk about value, the way that we talk about value these days within business, we've become used to talking about it, for me is not necessarily very helpful. It serves a role, but it isn't necessarily helpful. So we talk about value, we tend to talk about value as something incredibly subjective. So value is whatever anyone wants it to be. And that very much fits the economic dominant model and set of assumptions, which is obviously the neoclassical economic approach, which is aligned to the neoliberal ideology. And that's really about saying that the role of businesses is not to try to really, it's not to try to shape preferences of customers and the marketplace. It's to find out what people want and deliver it for them, deliver it to them. And the idea being that what people buy is what people think is valuable, and what is valuable is therefore going to be the best way of that person increasing their utility. And utility is another word for welfare or well-being, more specifically, and the term that I focus on, because we could choose many: flourishing, a good life, but well-being is probably the best umbrella term. We might as well pick one and then really focus in on debating what we mean by that and what precisely it means. So it's hard for me to say so it was probably when I started really understanding and studying business that the word and the term value became clear as being central, and that was back in 1995 when I did my management sciences undergraduate. But in terms of the concept of what value really is ultimately, that's something that goes back to when I was a teenager, and I was very much observing in conversations that I was listening into of adults about what we were perceiving a good life, what culturally, and that, of course this is within UK society, but this sense that somehow it was incredibly related to what you owned, and therefore incredibly related to how much money you had, and therefore what job you had. So it was very much about material goods and status, and that had no bearing on what I had deduced from when I was a child about what makes happiness. Now, happiness is a term I'm not going to use again, because we know that well-being is not the same as happiness. So this isn't about being joyful all the time. Well-being is very much about living a meaningful, good life. But I could really sense that there was something awry, and I wasn't sure why society's view of well-being was so different to the view of well-being that felt true to me. And that's not just myself as an individual, but observing others. You know, when we would say things like, you know, what are the things that you really look back and remember? What are your most precious memories? You know, people don't talk about things, and they don't talk about possessions, they don't talk about money, they talk about relationships and experiences. So that was really my first reflections, and they were deep reflections, you know, daily reflections on this topic, and that led me to studying business and trying to understand what was going on, and then led to a specialism in marketing from that, because marketing really is the engine room of value creation. So the question is really, what do we mean by value? Because if we're not clear about what we mean by value, then in a business that is focused mostly on maximizing profit, it's quite clear how we end up with very forms of value that might not necessarily be valuable, and ultimately might destroy the basis of value creation in the first place.
That's really interesting. So really what we're trying to sort of define here then is there almost this difference between what value is, but then really importantly, what value isn't. So if I sort of paraphrase what you've just described there, is that I think to a lot of people, value can be seen as a material kind of outcome to some activity, some venture, some purchase. But actually what you're saying is that it's a much more kind of holistic, emotional kind of engagement with something. And you talk about obviously their well-being, and you talk about, you know, leading a sort of a meaningful life, and I guess then what you're saying is actually it's much more about the human engagement with something rather than an absolute physical object. So it's much more experiential than value, rather than just a tangible thing.
What I suppose I'm saying is that if we cannot just say that value is ultimately subjective, as in it totally depends on the individual, because what that has led to is a lot of the marketing and business activities which say, well, look, you know, people are buying it, we're making profits, we must be doing something valuable, and that has been almost the excuse. And we have to be really clear as a global society at the very highest level, what is it ultimately that we're trying to achieve? Now, of course, what is well-being, how that shows up in different places, it needs to be continually debated. But I think we need to be clear that there is an outcome that we're working towards, or certainly we're clear sort of in the realm in which it sits, and we're clear what it isn't. So, you know, undermining our ability for, you know, nutrition, which is, you know, the basis of subsistence, which is one, obviously, it's perhaps the critical factor of well-being, is not very sensible. Whereas other kinds of value, like being able to participate and have a coherent sense of identity, those things are valuable. So as you might have noticed, what I'm starting to talk there about are what we understand to be universal human needs. So when we're looking at what well-being is, there are lots of disciplines that have looked at the concept of well-being from different areas, but we know that there's something around the fulfillment of human needs, and we know that there are human needs that are universal. Now, at that level, we're talking about, I could say subsistence, so the ability to survive, but that often then gets confused with the material goods needed to deliver that subsistence. But actually, if we take a look at all the other needs, they're actually psychological needs. So, so we're talking about participation, identity, freedom, creation. And when you're talking about the level of human needs, there's a difference between what those needs are and how you deliver them. And we need to be really clear about that distinction. So yes, there are multiple ways in which you can deliver all those needs. But what the needs theorists would underline, and there have been many that have come up with the same conclusion, is you can put them into different boxes, but there are certain things that we need in a measure, a sufficient measure, whatever that is, in order to be able to have well-being, to be in a good place. We also then have research that talks about aspects that fall into those buckets. So things like, for example, autonomy and mastery, and even, purpose. So doing things that are worthwhile. So we can put these into whichever boxes we want, but we do know more than we think that we know about this sort of human pursuit of what is a good life. So what I'm saying is that whatever we do within business or within our lives, we need to anchor against a sense of what this outcome is. Because what we've lost, I would say, in the last 50 years of the way that we've approached business, we've lost that connection with that ultimate goal. So when we said to business, so prior to the sort of, the sort of very heavy, you might say, neoclassical, neoliberal approach, very sort of all-encompassing, you might say, there were many businesses that were started to fulfill a perceived need in society. So that's not new. But what happened in those sort of 50, 60 years is we took on a sort of a model of economics that said, at its heart, business, your role is not to focus on that well-being. That is the role of government. The role of government is there to sort out other issues, social issues. Your role is to focus on profitability and maximizing those profits for the people who've invested in them. It's the sort of Friedman ideology, you might say. And in neoclassical economics, value is created by satisfying customers. But how you satisfy customers, as I was mentioning before, is not something that is, it's not there for you to try to, it's not the role of business to understand those, the nature of those preferences and why they exist and whether they're the right preferences. That would be a distortion of the market in the theory. So the role of business is to perceive what people are saying that they want and then deliver it to them. And of course, we use lots of market insight for that, but we also read the market and we say, well, okay, profits are going up and sales are going up, then clearly we're doing something valuable. So what I'm really saying is, and this is what we're seeing in terms of the revolution of purpose and the idea that organizations should be purpose-driven. One of the ways in which I summarize this is to say, instead of organizations outsourcing well-being and saying the market will take care of that as long as we are profitable and we are growing in terms of market share, those are signs that we're delivering what people want. And then they also do talk about jobs. And we're creating jobs, and that's a direct well-being impact. But other than that, that's sort of the role of business. And well-being will take care of itself. Value is therefore assumed to be ultimately subjective and an intermediary effect. What we're seeing with the move to purpose is the internalizing of those well-being outcomes into the organization. So rather than saying that's not our job, that's an outcome of a successful marketplace, businesses are saying that doesn't seem to have been going that well. society is telling us that we need to take a greater role in directly accounting for that well-being, because what we're producing is having effects, knock-on effects, that are undermining that well-being. We're not taking enough care to know whether or not we're actually doing more harm than good. And whilst government is supposed to take the role of mopping up any issues, putting in laws that we then adhere to, we're also at the same time lobbying them not to put in many laws, and we want them to be small government. And with the rise of corporations in terms of their monetary power, you know, many companies being bigger than countries, the system's not working. And when we hear people like Larry Fink make their statements, you know, he's specifically saying society is looking to us to fulfill the role that government can no longer do. And what that's really saying, in the way that I would put it, is that well-being is not being taken care of by the system. And the system that says outsource that well-being is not working. And organizations are therefore starting to flip the model and say, no, we need to be focused on delivering that well-being ourselves, be sure that we are, account for it, and be clear what it is that we're doing in that respect. And if we do that, then our investors might make money. And if we don't, we probably won't exist as a business.
And I think one of the things for me that I think I'm picking up on here is almost this kind of redefinition of what a successful, and I'll use that sort of term in its broadest sense, successful and sustainable and relevant business of 2020 and beyond is going to be, because I think the way you've described it there is it's almost like a new definition of business purpose. It is a new definition, certainly, of the marketing mix and the kind of almost the response of an organization, which, you know, as you've described there, is very, very different to, if we think sort of 30, 40, 50 years ago, it was a very different definition. So is value kind of bringing about this whole kind of importance of putting purpose at the center of everything?
Well, yeah, and I would say not just 20, 30 years ago, like now. So that is still the dominant view of business and the role of business in society. But since the 2008 crash, we are questioning that at a much deeper level. And I think really what we're seeing in terms of purpose and the sort of push towards purpose-driven organizations, in the way that I described purpose there, is really this sort of the conclusion, you might say, of the fallout of those successive financial crashes, of which the last was 2008, because we were suddenly allowed to ask the right questions. You know, we were suddenly, people went deeper than they had done before to say, what's wrong with this system? Why is this system not working? Not only have we been told since the 70s that we have ecological crises that are going to undermine our ability to deliver value in the first place, but now we're being shown that even on a financial basis, this system doesn't seem to be working very well. So I think purpose, like I said, in the way that is revolutionary, as you described it there, Neil, that is, is a fallout from that situation. And when you talk about value, I think that the thing is, it's about reinterpreting what value is. So I see purpose being about reinterpreting what value is and how it's delivered. So in terms of the what value is, it goes from, as I said, being whatever you want it to be, to no, actually, we need to be clear what we think value for our customers and stakeholders is. And that isn't just value in the short term or the sense of a sort of desire that we might have created through our marketing over the last 50 years, but this is real value. So value that contributes to the well-being of that individual or groups, and not just in the short term, but over time. So in the longer term, and at the same time that it doesn't destroy other people's well-being whilst doing that. Because if we're anchoring our purpose to this overall shared purpose of what I call long-term well-being for all, for me, that's the definition of sustainability. So it's well-being over time in a sustained way and not just for a few people. So purpose, when an organization arrives at its purpose, it's about really thinking, what are the problems that we can solve, that we are have the right in society to solve, but anchored against that frame of, why are you solving those problems? Because, and what kind of problems are they? Well, they're problems of well-being, and they're problems of well-being in the longer term. And they're problems of well-being for perhaps just a minority of people rather than a majority. So purpose for an organization is anchored against that long-term sense of well-being, and that therefore reinterprets what value is. It anchors it to something. Even though, as I say, we need to keep debating and defining what this well-being is and how best to deliver it, it has an anchor suddenly, rather than being just subjective. And in terms of how it's delivered, again, rather than being through the marketplace, it's something that organizations can start to come up, and we're seeing this all the time, hugely innovative strategies based on collaborations and partnerships in a way that we could never see in that old paradigm, because it just wasn't relevant. So value was hugely important over the last 50, 60 years in the dominant neoliberal paradigm. It was hugely important because it's a word that could mean almost anything you want it to mean. What we're seeing in the shift that we're going through is an anchoring of value and to something specific. We have choices to make. We need to be clear what we really think value is, like you say, and what it isn't. Because if we don't do that, then how are we going to deliver a sustainable society?
And I particularly like the way you're talking about anchors, and it's almost like embedding this into kind of like day-to-day practice. I guess a lot of people listening to this will be either from a sort of business leader perspective or from a marketing perspective. So I think maybe one of the anchors for them is going to be the concept of the marketing mix, because that is something that sort of day-to-day they will identify with because they're living and breathing it. So how do you feel that again, the concept of value within the marketing mix, if we were just, for example, to begin sort of thinking about product as obviously one of the P's in the marketing mix, how does value play out, in your opinion, Victoria, in the whole kind of creation of sort of value through products?
Absolutely. As we know, marketing is the value creation engine. That's what it's there to do. And, product servicing, the offering is really what it is. It's the essence of what it is that the organization is there to produce. So that has to be something that is valuable. Now, in the old paradigm or the current paradigm, that will be whatever's selling well. And obviously you do what you can to make that product sell as well as possible. You try and find out what people say that they would like in order to tweak that. And often, and we know this, I know this from my time in marketing myself as a marketer, also from teaching it for a number of years and interviews we've been doing recently with organizations, that is often what is it that we can make that grabs people's attention, that is shiny and new, that stands out from being different to everything around it, even if that difference is momentary, even if that difference is not actually providing any value. So when we start to anchor value to well-being, then the question is, what can we produce that will lead to the long-term well-being of our customers? And that's a very different, or potential customers. So that's a very different question to start with. It means you have to really get to understand your customers, really understand who they are, and what needs they really have. So which of those suite of needs are they deficient in? Why? In what way? What is not being delivered to them? So we see, and the research that we've been doing really highlights this, that if you start from what is a really valuable well-being outcome for our customers, if you start from that place, then you see all kinds of new decision-making going on in terms of product design, in terms of the process you go through, the level of co-creation that you would bring in, how you would decide whether a product should go ahead for development or not. all kinds of things. Now, obviously, you know, you're trying to lead your customers to a place through your products and services where they are wanting to consume something that you offer that will increase their well-being and does not destroy their well-being in the longer term because it degrades the environmental resources that we're all reliant on. So to do that, you have to think about transitioning consumption. So organizations, when they're thinking about their new product development in this context, would be thinking, okay, what are people currently consuming to fulfill X need? Or, you know, what is it that they're currently doing and how are they consuming? How can we take them on a journey to a place where they are consuming something that is sustainable, and therefore we can produce something that is sustainable. And by going on that journey together, you can arrive at the answer to that question, because you cannot sit in a room and say, what product do we design now? You know, what is going to be the sustainable product in 50 years that, rather than reducing the well-being of our customers, will increase it? You just can't sit there and design it. What you have to do is have a mentality that says we're going on a journey with our customers to refine our products and services so that they become increasingly more sustainable in terms of the resources that they use and sustainable in terms of the well-being that they produce.
And I guess when you talk from that perspective, it brings in the concept of other stakeholders, because this would be something, I guess, that a purpose-driven, value-creating organisation couldn't do in isolation. So how do you see this playing out with other sort of stakeholders? I mean, I guess taking the concept of people more generally, how does that sort of impact on the you know, I guess the longer supply chain in this process?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as we know, you know, organizations are human gatherings of ingenuity trying to do something that they couldn't do on their own. And purpose, when you put the well-being outcomes at the heart of your system, and you have big ambitions around that. So we talk, I'm just going to mention here about a sustainable purpose. So my definition of purpose would be anchored to long-term well-being for all, as in that would be the way in which organizations would anchor their purpose. And that for me is the definition of sustainability. So those things should be, you know, part and parcel. But when we're thinking about, therefore, what would a sustainable purpose look like, it's perhaps helpful, and I've been working with some colleagues from Cambridge. Ben Kellard has been convening a group to try to understand what is a sustainable purpose. And there are two key things. Either it's delivering well-being directly to a group or group of stakeholders, and doing it in a way that doesn't undermine the long-term well-being of others, or it's solving a big sustainability issue out there. And we see lots of organizations trying to solve these big sustainability issues. And Unilever is the classic one, you know, make sustainable living commonplace. I mean, that's a huge, huge goal that's about solving a big sustainability challenge. But even if you're solving a sustainability goal, you also need to be making sure you're not undermining other stakeholders. So if we imagine for a minute an organization that's trying to deliver that kind of purpose, firstly, it cannot operate in isolation. It cannot sit in a room and work out what is going to deliver well-being. It has to work with its stakeholders to understand that and what that value means across the whole value chain. Secondly, it can't possibly do that, solve those. How can you make sustainable living commonplace on your own? Even if you're a Unilever, which is a large organization, you can't possibly do that. So with the shift in understanding what we mean as value to be anchored in sustainability in terms of well-being over time, we see this shift to a sort of humility, you might say, that says, no, we don't have all the answers. It's not as simple as just trying to increase our profits. And I'm not trying to say that's not a difficult thing to do. It is, but purpose-driven organizations are also trying to be financially sustainable and grow their business because they believe that their business delivers the best well-being. So why wouldn't you want your organization to grow? So they have to do all those hygiene factors. They have to produce things that people want now, but they have to do that plus. So marketing plus, and stakeholders are absolutely central. They are the basis on which you can deliver any value. And whilst we always knew that, because purpose as the definition of value, because that is a systemic concept, so it's about the long term and the interconnected, you cannot avoid the fact that you need to work with your whole system to bring about the value you want to create.
I'd like to just pick up for a moment on the point that you make there about sort of creation of profit. It feels to me, the way that you're describing it, that this is not only sustainable in terms of being, you know, the right thing to do for the well-being of all, and sort of drawing again on your sort of definitions from earlier, but from a profitability perspective of sustainable business, it feels like the business of the future, or you could argue the business of today, it almost has to be taking this approach to be profitable into the future. Do you see that value creation, working to a high purpose, is going to be the way that profitability is almost traded into the future? Do you see this as being a really sort of, you know, absolute essential building block in this new marketing mix that we're defining here?
Absolutely, it is the absolute core, and it is really just the basis of good marketing. You know, I mean, describing that marketing should be about delivering long-term well-being for all is, I mean, Kotler and Levy talked about that in 1969 and even earlier. This is in their societal marketing concept. So these are not new concepts, but you could argue that we've just kind of got away with making the world far more simple than it is. Over many, many years, we fooled ourselves into thinking that the complex, systemic world of interconnected relationships that is the world somehow isn't relevant to business. And so therefore we made our lives much easier. But what we did was ignore what was really going on out there. And we are now at the point we can't ignore that anymore. Nature is not letting us ignore it. Society is not letting us ignore it. And therefore, a business that tries to maintain a sort of blinkered view of the world, that takes certain assumptions as true, even though they're blatantly not true, then that organization will not be able to survive in the longer term. It just will not. And whilst, you know, you're bound to get some free riders in this situation, and there'll always be some that can manipulate loopholes and whatever. Yes, sure, you will always get those kinds of organizations that operate on the fringes. But for an organization that wants to be the kind of organization that investors feel that they can invest in, that society wants to have around, I can't see how an organization that doesn't deliver real value in a way that doesn't undermine the value of those customers in the longer term or of everyone else is going to survive. They're just not going to be allowed to.
So how then do you feel that people, businesses, marketers, decision makers, business leaders are actually getting this whole thing wrong? Because it sounds like it's almost an ideal then for business of the future, for marketing approaches, for just general economics, you know, into the future. How are people actually getting this so wrong right now? Why are there blinkers on? Why are a lot of people, a lot of organizations still probably not getting it?
Well, that comes down to the basis of human psychology, sociology, anthropology. You know, the way that we are built. We have a herd mentality. We don't like to be doing the unusual thing. And when we have developed over 40, 50, 60 years, a deep cultural set of assumptions about the role of business in society, and we have built systems within our organizations that uphold and reinforce that. And therefore we have conversations and behaviors that uphold and reinforce that paradigm. It is very, 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 very difficult to then step out of it. And there are many wonderful quotes of people saying, you know, that, it's the most difficult thing is to change the system you're within. So So how do we both operate a system that is the way that the world works now, whilst at the same time operating a new system that we know needs to come about, and hold that dualism in our heads? And that's not just holding it conceptually in our heads, that's holding it every time we go into a meeting in any business setting, where the dominant agenda, the language, the body language, the who's in the room is all based on the old paradigm. And yet trying to hold this new emerging paradigm in our heads and bring it about at the same time. So it is hard, very hard. And especially the fact that it has to happen quickly. So we don't have the luxury of time on this. We need this to happen. And that's probably perhaps the saving grace, because in a way, you know, it's easy to slip into old ways of thinking when there isn't a consistent pressure. So I think that's the key thing, really. What is going to make this easier for business is the fact that there's been a lot of groundwork over many decades, but that groundwork is ramping up. So we're seeing exponential change in the system, and we're seeing more and more pressure, sustained pressure from different perspectives. So just when an organization might start to think, oh, well, you know, that was a nice idea, that whole purpose thing, but hang on, let's just get back to what we, you know, that's past now. We can go back to what we know and what works. Another wave of pressure comes in. And whilst, you know, we could argue that therefore as society we need to keep that pressure up, we also know we get easily distracted by other things. However, we know on this topic there is unfortunately only one way street. You only have to look at the science on sustainability, on water, on soil, on ocean acidification, on climate change, on biodiversity loss, and we know that these issues are not going away. Unfortunately, they're getting stronger and louder. And whilst they get stronger and louder, societal's recognition, pain as a result of that will get stronger and louder. So, so it's hard, but an organization that really understands this should have faith to keep on the journey, because it's not going away. It's just going to get more pronounced.
So who are the pioneers, right? Are there any organizations or sectors who are kind of leading?
Yeah, we do have a number of organizations that have been sort of spearheading this for a long time. So we have a group of organizations who were sort of set up as purpose-driven organizations. And those ones can tell us a lot about what works when you are free of all your historical weight of decision making in the old paradigm. And then we have a group of organizations who are going through the transition. I don't think we have any organizations who are out the other side of the transition. It's a long and tough journey, but they are head and shoulders above and really the guiding light for many other organizations, not just around, you know, what purpose looks like, but how do you get there? And that's the research that I'm doing with colleagues in Judge Business School. We're trying to really understand that from a marketing perspective, and so that we can help people who are trying to move on this journey to understand what it really means. So, for example, and then finally we have sort of a whole group of companies that are starting up now to solve particular problems for society and therefore address well-being in different ways. And so we have those. So in the first category, you have the organizations like Patagonia, like Ben and Jerry's, like Green and Blacks, like The Body Shop. So those kinds of clear sort of ground-breaking organizations that were set up to solve problems of well-being, and those and I think many people understand those. And whilst it's frustrating sometimes that we tend to often fall in on the same examples, I think it's because and there probably are many other examples, but they really are worthy of note-taking on how radically they have approached how they operate in the marketplace. So you have those, and then you have the kind of group that have transitioned, or well, like I say, are transitioning, and some of those are very mature in that journey, you might say. So organizations like Interface, they've been doing that for quite some time, but they had to go through a transition. So they can tell us something about that. Obviously Unilever, we have Marks and Spencer's, we have now a whole raft of companies who are in one way or another at the stage of that journey. Actually, I'll add Natura, who now own Body Shop, to the first group as well, because they had quite a lot of purpose-driven roots. I'd say in that second category of transition organisations, there's a sort of a blur, because many of those organisations started off as being purpose-driven when they were first formed. So the sort of, you know, the Unilevers, the Centricas, those who were there to really provide for society's well-being, and that's what they were formed to do. And those, and when we've interviewed a range of organisations that sit in that category, there tends to be a sense that they sort of maybe lost their way in this period of very specific neoliberal, neoclassical economic assumptions. They sort of became part of that system, and then they look around now and say, oh, you know, hang on a minute, but we were different before, so maybe we can go back and look at that. So yeah, a range of companies in, and IKEA, and again, different stages of the journey, but a number of organizations in there. And then of course, I mean, there are many places in the social enterprise world, but also in the B Corp world, where you can look for the sort of newer, younger startups that are starting out as purpose-driven, but are still sort of finding their feet in that area. Obviously, I'm not saying all B Corps are like that by any means, but it attracts those kinds of organizations. I mean, Natura, for example, that falls into the first category, was the first listed company, I believe, to become a B Corp. So yeah, so a range of places that we can look for inspiration, really.
And I can imagine many marketers listening to this thinking, you know, if I get on this journey, I could use all of these concepts, all of this language, all of this kind of new way of doing business as part of my marketing communications and I say promotions.
Yes, I do, Neil. But I think this is where the big caveat comes in, because what we have seen is sort of putting the cart before the horse. So, and to be able to tell a truly purpose-driven story is gold dust for any organization, because it's an emotionally compelling, meaningful message that engages and energizes stakeholders of all kinds. So who wouldn't want a message like that to be able to go out there with? And that's the power of purpose, because it does tap in to what is humanly meaningful. This being in service of others' well-being is at the heart of what makes us human, and gives us this sort of warm glow, which is incredibly powerful. But the problem is that marketers, because, and I'm just going to say a few words now about how I see marketing within the system, I believe that whilst we should have moved to an era of marketing orientated companies, i.e., and that came in with neoclassical thinking, so the idea that value is created by satisfying customers, that should have put marketing at the very heart of organizations. But when we look at what's actually happened, most of the evidence would suggest that most companies are not marketing orientated. They are still quite internally focused and sales focused. So it's about producing what they know how to produce and then selling stuff. And then there might be a lot of customer insight going on, but that's just in order to work out what you can sell more of, rather than really trying to understand the preferences of customers. So I'm now using the old language. So I would argue that therefore marketing, the reason why marketing ends up often to being like an end of pipe sales tool that looks more like sales than it does like marketing, as in real value creation, is because if you're working within a system that says, yes, we want to satisfy customers, but ultimately our purpose is profit or sales, then conflict, like your 5-10 year, or say 3 to 5 year mark to really deliver value for the organization, will come in conflict with a weekly or a monthly sales target. So we see that all the time, the sort of, you know, marketing being trumped by profits, really. So it's kind of not surprising that marketing's ended up where it has done. So therefore, if marketing, it's not therefore surprising that when purpose comes along, marketing is not hooked in with the center of the organization often enough that it should be, and it has a fairly sales orientated hat on. So it's not surprising therefore that they take this sort of idea and this intention to be a purpose-driven organization and overstep the mark in terms of how it's used in promotions. So it becomes very much a sort of overstating where the organization is in order to sell more stuff. And the problem with that is that you undermine everything about what it is to be purpose-driven, and you risk not being able to credibly go back to your stakeholders if and when you do become truly purpose-driven. So the message would really be that it's really, there are two things. There's purpose intent, and then there's purpose implementation. So marketing has a massive role to play, and communications and promotions have a massive role to play in that marketing intent, trying to make that mature, trying to make it really embedded throughout the organization and stakeholders. But what that is an intent. So what it is to say, this is what this organization wants to achieve. And that marketing promotions need to be aligned with where that organization is. If it's just the CEO's made an announcement, that is not a developed intent. That is a CEO making an announcement. A well-developed intent would be that you could go to anyone in the organization and say, what is your purpose? And they would be able to say. Now, that doesn't mean, however, that that organization has implemented that intent. And this is where the importance, again, of the nuancing of the marketing communications language becomes so important. Because what we need is a leadership approach that says, this is our intent. It truly is our intent. But delivering it is going to be really tough. It's going to take a long time. So this sort of brave, vulnerable leadership language coming through, it's going to take a long time. But this is our plan. This is our strategy. And this is how we're going to transition. And then marketing's role is to expose that leadership language to stakeholders, not to say, we've done it, we are this, but to explain and build relationships, to take people on the journey with the customer. So it's not about sales, it's about relationships. It's about building the deep relationships with stakeholders, customers and other stakeholders, so that you can go on that journey, so that you have the freedom to go on that journey and the support to go on that journey. So yes, I think, you know, the sort of new way that we're interpreting value is hugely powerful for marketing and marketing promotions. The role of marketers is to make sure that it starts to embed itself deeply within the organization and starts to re-understand its role in value creation away from sales, as away from an end of pipe solution, and actually the engine room of well-being creation for an organization.
What top tips would you have then for anyone looking to begin using the concept of value within their marketing or their wider business?
Well, I mean, as you know, there are a set of principles for evolved value, which we call the Evolved Value Framework, that myself and colleagues have put together, which sets out sets out the 6 principles as we see them, to help organizations ask themselves the question about where they are on that journey, from being focused on either sales or customer satisfaction or purpose. So I would take a look at those and start to, because the first thing I think that organizations need to do and marketers need to do is a period of self-reflection that says, which paradigm are we operating from? What structures our decision-making? What is it about the way that we operate and our decision-making that is incompatible with delivering well-being value? And how can we notice them, package them up, and put them on the desk of the decision maker that can do something about it? So, for example, if you're being pushed for weekly sales targets above everything else, it's going to be very, very difficult for you to be able to create space to do anything different. So understanding, so we have a principle of long-term and systemic thinking. So one of the reflections might be, that is a really big issue. It's out of our hands. We might be able, this is what we can do, but this is the bit we can't do. So, and then put it on the desk of someone and say, if you want us to be to deliver the purpose and to be a sustainable organization, you need to deal with this bit because it's affecting the way we make decisions. So, so I would say empowerment, self-empowerment around what you can do within your part of the system to drive this forward is probably the way to go. And I think those 6 principles will sort of help shine a light on where things might be more difficult, and a sense of reflecting on what good for your organization would look like. What kinds of incentives would be there? What sorts of marketing communications would be signed off and which ones wouldn't? What would your agency relationships look like? When would you give up business because even though it might be profitable, it doesn't fit with what you think is truly valuable in the world? So there are a whole range of things you can do, but it starts with going deep and understanding what logics you're operating from in your organization.
Well, this has been an incredible journey and experience for all of us, I think, and everybody listening, I'm sure, will have seen a huge benefit in terms of their thinking. And I think that word that you just used there, Victoria, the concept of reflection, I think is so, so important in this whole process for everybody, no matter where they are on the journey. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you, Victoria, very much for sharing all of your knowledge and insights with us. And if anybody is interested in hearing an even deeper dive into some of the very specific things that we talked about throughout this recording, please feel free to add your comments and thoughts in the message thread below. We'd very much like to hear from you, and there will be an opportunity for us to do further recordings for you. So share any of your thoughts and feelings on what you'd like to hear more of, and we will endeavour to perform for you. So thank you very much, Victoria, again, and we look forward to catching up with everyone listening and a recording very, very soon.